For almost the entire history of the sitcom, there was an unspoken rule sitting underneath nearly every episode ever made. Characters could mess up, fight, scheme, and cause chaos for 22 minutes, but by the end, they had to learn something. A hug, a lesson, a quiet moment of growth before the credits rolled, resetting the emotional temperature so the audience went to bed feeling good about humanity. Then, in 1989, a stand-up comedian and a fellow writer sat down inside a Korean deli in Manhattan and pitched something that broke that rule completely. No hugging, no learning. Characters who stayed exactly, stubbornly, hilariously the same, episode after episode, season after season, never once absorbing a life lesson, never once becoming better people. Executives at the network were reportedly baffled by the pitch. A sitcom about nothing sounded, on paper, like the opposite of a sellable idea. And yet, somehow, that show didn't just succeed. It quietly rewired the entire genetic code of American comedy, so thoroughly that decades later, you can draw a direct, traceable line from a joke about a marble rye bread to some of the sharpest, most acclaimed comedies currently airing. Some of the specific bits from that show didn't just become popular. They became so deeply embedded in how English-speaking audiences actually talk and joke that most people using the phrases today have no idea they're quoting a sitcom at all. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly which Seinfeld jokes reshaped the DNA of comedy itself, and why one specific writer's room rule, 4 simple words, might be the single most influential piece of comedy philosophy of the last 40 years. Let's start with that origin story, because it explains everything that followed. Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David first started talking through the idea for the show that would eventually bear Seinfeld's name after running into each other at a comedy club called Catch a Rising Star, a conversation that reportedly continued and crystallized inside Lee's Market, a Korean deli across the street. The two devised something deceptively simple. Take small, genuinely insignificant problems, the kind of thing most people wouldn't even consider worth mentioning out loud, and let those tiny frustrations spiral into surprisingly large consequences. Crucially, the characters themselves would never actually change because of it. No emotional journeys, no hard-won wisdom, just the same 4 flawed, self-absorbed people, making the same self-absorbed mistakes, over and over, seemingly incapable of growth. Larry David codified that entire philosophy into an actual rule for the writer's room, one that's been quoted so often it's become comedy folklore in its own right. No hugging, no learning. It sounds almost like a joke itself, but it was treated with total seriousness inside the show's production. Every other sitcom on the air in the late 1980s and early 1990s was still structured around the old model. A sympathetic character facing a moral dilemma, learning something meaningful, ending the episode wiser than they started it. Seinfeld's characters were explicitly forbidden from that kind of growth. Whatever selfish, petty, or short-sighted decision got them into trouble in act, one was almost guaranteed to get them into trouble again in some future episode, because nobody involved was ever allowed to actually learn the lesson. This wasn't just a stylistic quirk, it was a genuinely radical rejection of what a sitcom was supposed to be for. Comedy before Seinfeld tended to use humor as a delivery mechanism for some kind of takeaway, a value, a moral, even a loosely disguised piece of advice. Seinfeld argued, implicitly, through its entire structure, that comedy didn't need to justify itself with meaning at all. Life's absurdities, the annoyance of a slow line, the etiquette of double-dipping a chip, the mystery of why a coworker keeps talking a little too close to your face, could be funny entirely on their own terms, without a lesson stapled onto the end to make them feel worthwhile. That premise gave rise to a comedic style Jerry Seinfeld had already been developing for years on stage. Pure, relentless observational comedy. Rather than telling stories with clear setups and punchlines, Seinfeld's stand-up, and by extension the show's writing, tended to zero in on a specific, oddly universal social ritual and simply interrogate why it existed at all. A huge number of his bits, on stage and in the show alike, begin with some version of the exact same question. What is actually going on with this thing we all just quietly accept without questioning it? That interrogative instinct, treating ordinary social behavior like a genuine mystery worth solving, became the connective tissue running through nearly every storyline the show ever produced. Now, let's talk about the specific bits, because a handful of them didn't just make people laugh in 1993 or 1996, they actually changed the vocabulary English speakers use to describe real life. Take the concept of the close talker, a term for someone who stands uncomfortably near your face during ordinary conversation, invading a stranger's personal space without any apparent awareness they're doing it. Before that episode aired, there was no widely shared, instantly understood shorthand for that specific social phenomenon. Afterward, there was. People still use the phrase today, in offices, at parties, in casual conversation, often with zero idea it originated from a 1994 sitcom episode at all. The same is true of the low talker, someone who speaks so quietly you're forced to nod along in a conversation you can barely actually hear, a phrase that entered everyday usage so completely it now functions almost like an official piece of social vocabulary. Or take double dipping, the minor food etiquette violation of dipping a chip, taking a bite, and then dipping the same bitten chip back into a shared bowl. The show didn't invent the behavior, obviously. People had presumably been doing this at parties for decades, but it gave the specific social faux pas a name, a label so effective that the phrase has become the default way English speakers describe that exact behavior, whether or not they've ever seen a single episode of the show it came from. Then there's regifting, the practice of taking a gift you received and passing it along to someone else as though it were new. Again, the behavior existed long before the show. What didn't exist, at least not in any widely recognized form, was a single, catchy word for it. After that episode aired, regifting became not just a punchline, but an actual, functional part of the English language, appearing in dictionaries, casual conversation, and, eventually, workplace holiday party etiquette guides that had nothing to do with television at all. Some of the show's most famous bits went even further. Less about coining new vocabulary and more about smuggling genuinely taboo, difficult subject matter into mainstream primetime comedy through pure verbal misdirection. The episode built around a contest to see who among the four friends could go the longest without a certain private habit, never once actually says the word it's dancing around, relying entirely on innuendo, euphemism, and increasingly desperate physical comedy to communicate something the show's own network standards department would never have allowed stated outright. The phrase "master of your domain," used throughout that episode as a euphemistic badge of honor, became so instantly, permanently associated with the show's cleverness at working around content restrictions that it's still referenced today as a kind of gold standard for how comedy can imply something scandalous without ever technically saying it. There's also the phrase, "not that there's anything wrong with that," delivered repeatedly throughout an episode, dealing with two characters being mistakenly assumed to be a couple, functioning simultaneously as a punchline and as a genuinely notable moment of a mainstream network sitcom in the mid-90s directly, if carefully, engaging with contemporary attitudes towards sexuality. The phrase became so widely repeated afterward that it eventually took on a life entirely independent of the show itself, used ironically or sincerely in completely unrelated contexts by people who may never have watched a single full episode. And then there's Festivus, a fictional, deliberately anti-commercial holiday, invented for a single Christmas season episode, featuring an unadorned aluminum pole instead of a tree, a ritualized airing of grievances instead of polite small talk, and feats of strength instead of gift exchanges. What began as a one-episode joke has since become something genuinely strange and remarkable. An actual, real-world tradition, celebrated by real people, on real calendars, every December, decades after the joke that invented it originally aired, a level of cultural adoption almost no other single sitcom episode in television history has ever achieved. A different kind of legacy came from an episode built around a real New York City soup vendor, known for his strict, almost tyrannical rules about how customers were required to order. The fictionalized version of that vendor, and the nickname the show gave him, became so culturally dominant afterward that variations of the phrase started appearing to describe any authority figure enforcing petty, exacting rules with disproportionate severity. A barista, a bureaucrat, a strict parent, entirely detached from soup or from the show itself. It's a genuinely unusual kind of legacy for a joke to have. Less a punchline people remember fondly and more an entire linguistic template other people keep reaching for. Decades later, whenever they need to describe someone enforcing rules nobody asked for. There's also a whole category of these bits that worked less by naming a universal social rule and more by giving comedy audiences a permanently usable insult or shorthand for a very specific kind of person. Man hands, describing a woman whose hands are perceived as unusually large or masculine, became an instantly recognizable, if fairly unkind, cultural shorthand almost overnight. Shrinkage, a euphemism born from an episode dealing with the effects of cold water on the male body, similarly escaped the show entirely, becoming a widely understood punchline independent of its original context. And Bizarro World, a phrase borrowed loosely from Superman comics to describe an alternate, inverted version of the show's usual friend group, populated by opposite versions of Jerry, Elaine, and the rest, became such an effective piece of comedic shorthand that people now use the term bizarro to describe any strange, inverted mirror version of something familiar in contexts that have nothing to do with either comic books or sitcoms at all. There's also a case to be made that Seinfeld's influence extends beyond comedy formulas and vocabulary alone into something closer to a broader cultural permission slip. Once one of the most watched shows on American television proved conclusively, over 9 seasons, that audiences didn't actually need their comedy characters to grow, apologize, or improve in order to keep tuning in, it became dramatically easier for future writers to pitch shows built around characters who stayed exactly, unapologetically themselves. That permission is arguably still shaping television now, in shows about people who never quite learn their lesson, made by writers who grew up absorbing the idea that comedy doesn't owe anyone a moral. So, why did this particular show's specific brand of joke end up seeping so deeply into everyday language and behavior in a way most sitcom humor, however popular in its own moment, simply never does? Part of the answer comes back to that original writing philosophy, because the show was built entirely around real, recognizable social friction rather than manufactured, plot-driven conflict. Its jokes were never really about the characters at all. They were about you, about a behavior or a social rule you'd personally encountered 100 times without ever having language for it. A joke about a fictional crime or a wildly improbable sitcom scheme lives and dies with that particular episode. A joke that finally puts a name to something universally, awkwardly familiar has a much better chance of escaping the show entirely and becoming part of how people actually talk. The show's influence didn't stop at vocabulary, though. It fundamentally reshaped the architecture of the sitcoms that came after it. Herb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David's own follow-up project, essentially took the no-hugging, no-learning philosophy and pushed it even further, building an entire show around a fictionalized version of David himself refusing, episode after episode, to learn even the most basic lessons about social decency. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia leaned even harder into morally repugnant, entirely unchanging characters, explicitly building its entire premise around a group of friends whose complete absence of growth or self-awareness is the whole engine of the comedy. Even The Office, on the surface, an entirely different visual format built around mockumentary realism rather than a live studio audience, inherited Seinfeld's core insight that deeply flawed, frequently unlikable characters could still be genuinely, sustainably funny to watch, without the show needing to redeem them by the finale. Not everyone in the television industry welcomed this shift with open arms, and it's worth being honest about that pushback because it reveals just how different Seinfeld's comedic philosophy really was from what came before it. Glenn Charles, co-creator of Cheers, one of the most beloved sitcoms of the prior decade, has been notably critical of exactly this influence, arguing that observational humor built purely around petty grievance, noticing something absurd without offering any deeper comment on it, has come to dominate modern comedy in a way he personally finds limiting. Whether you side with that critique or not, the fact that a creator of Cheers' stature felt compelled to publicly push back against Seinfeld's influence says something significant on its own. You don't argue against a trend that didn't actually take over the entire genre. There's a reason this particular show gets credited, again and again, across decades of television criticism, as the exact hinge point where the American sitcom pivoted away from its earlier, more sentimental instincts. 1987 had already introduced a much more openly dysfunctional, contemptuous kind of TV family. 1989 brought an animated show willing to gleefully mock the entire sitcom format it was still technically operating inside of. And that same year, 1989, brought a show that didn't mock the format so much as quietly abandon its most sacred rule altogether: the assumption that comedy needed to end somewhere meaningful, So the next time you catch yourself describing someone as a close talker, or joking about regifting a bad birthday present, or vaguely referencing Festivus as a lighthearted way to complain about the holidays, you're not just making a passing pop culture reference. You're speaking in a vocabulary that a stand-up comedian and a fellow writer accidentally built for the entire English language over a conversation in a Korean deli more than 3 decades ago, simply by asking the same question over and over about the tiny, absurd, universally annoying things everyone else had always been too polite to actually mention out loud,